8 months after my divorce was final, Human Resources delivered the envelope to me. It was still sealed with tape. Under a coffee mug and a phone charger was Marcus's old company key card. I nearly giggled. I swiped it on the server room door, more out of habit than anything, expecting nothing. The light changed to green, but nobody switched it off. Nobody switched mine off either. Dot. My name is Dana Whitfield, and before that morning, I really believed the worst part of the entire last year was behind me once and for all. I'm the Director of Operations at Whitfield Freight Solutions, the trucking and logistics company my dad started in 1987 with 2 rented trucks and a fax machine. When I was a kid, I used to climb all over those trucks. I learned to read a balance sheet before I learned to drive a car. And the one thing I trusted absolutely, regardless of what else happened in my marriage, was the company, because it was my father's, and my father never lied to me. I left that key card in my desk drawer for 3 days before I used it again. I told myself it was caution, not suspicion. But careful people avoid checking server logs at 11 at night, alone, with the office lights out and only the glow of a monitor for company. And that's what I was doing when I found the first thing that didn't make sense. I nearly didn't look. I felt like closing the laptop, telling myself it was old data, a system quirk, and nothing to lose sleep over. But something made my hands stay on the mouse. Perhaps it was 11 years of learning to see the small silences in that family, the things no one said aloud but everyone understood anyway. Dot. 3 names, 3 consulting contracts, all funneled through a company called Birchgate Partners. Direct access to our vendor systems. This is neither a project nor a temporary arrangement. 14 months. That's forever. It's been going on. I asked my father about it the next morning, casually, over coffee in his office, the same office he'd had since I was in elementary school. He waved a hand, like it wasn't a big deal. That was Eleanor's doing, he said, mother of Marcus. He mentioned that the business advisory involved streamlining vendor relationships. He didn't recall signing anything special. He said that Eleanor was always excellent at managing vendor relationships. I held my face still. I'd been married into that family for 11 years, and I'd learned how skilled Eleanor Coyle was at that sort of thing. Eleanor never yelled. She didn't have to. She could change a room when she entered it. She could position individuals as she desired and determine who spoke and when, all while maintaining a smile as if she were doing everyone a favor. She used to give gifts at holidays that were a little too specific, a little too well-researched, the kind that made you wonder how she'd known. A rare book for my dad, a scarf in the very shade I'd once said I liked, months ago, to someone who wasn't her. I thought it was just her personality. She was a woman of iron will. Her old-fashioned views were often excused, much like those of wealthy grandmothers. It took me years to understand that with Eleanor, nothing was ever just personality. It was just a matter of where to put it. Each gift, each introduction, and each casual mention of a cousin who happened to be seeking employment was a piece shuffled into place on a board that only she could see. Dot. So I didn't ask any more questions aloud. I started asking them quietly, at night, with a legal pad and a spreadsheet, cross-referencing hire dates against names I half remembered from Coyle family dinners. Dot. The first was simple. 18 months ago, we hired Craig Lassiter to join our audit committee, and he had previously worked for Eleanor's firm for 6 years. We hired Craig Lassiter for our audit committee 18 months ago, and had worked for Eleanor's firm for 6 years before that. My father regarded him as a recommendation, using the term in the same way that others might use a name, implying that it provided all the necessary information and that no further inquiry was required. Wendy Ostrander, a procurement manager, had borrowed money privately from a holding company that was connected to Birchgate through 3 layers of shell companies. A holding company, connected to Birchgate through 3 layers of shell companies, had lent money privately to Wendy Ostrander, who was a procurement manager at Birchgate. Wendy approved nearly every vendor contract that crossed my father's desk. She'd had it for 2 years. I had sat across from her in meetings and eaten lunch with her in the break room, and it had never once occurred to me who she really answered to. Dot. The third was Gary Fenwick, the lead for warehouse operations, whose daughter's tuition had been paid, in full, quietly, by a scholarship fund on whose board of directors Eleanor's name appeared. Gary was responsible for scheduling 3 of our biggest freight contracts. Better than almost anyone, he would have known exactly when shipments moved and exactly when no one was watching too closely. 4 people, 4 important positions. The 3-year project, one at a time, was slow enough that no one watching casually would ever connect them. I wrote their names on my legal pad, and I looked at the shape of something far greater than 4 job offers. This was not good luck. This was not favoritism. It was architecture. I sat with that spreadsheet until 2 in the morning, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since the divorce. Not grief, not precisely anger. It was something cooler and more useful than that, something with edges. I thought back to the wedding 6 years ago and the toast Eleanor made about family being the only investment that never depreciates. I recalled laughing along with everyone else at the time, considering it a charmingly old-fashioned remark. I reflected on how she had smiled at me throughout her speech and held her glass just a bit too high, as if she already possessed knowledge that I did not, knowledge she had held long before I walked down that aisle. The next part took more time. Contracts do not confess, not easily. I had to learn to read them the way my father once taught me to read a load manifest, not at what was listed, but at what should have been listed and wasn't. For 3 nights, I sat with a highlighter and a pot of coffee, working through language dense enough to make my eyes ache, until the pattern finally emerged. Birchgate was more than a consult. 3 of our largest vendor agreements had a margin-sharing clause in them, but it was written so blandly it was like boilerplate, and you could skim right over it unless you knew to look for it. That sent a percentage of every renegotiated contract back through Birchgate as a relationship management fee. It wasn't theft, not really. It was worse than theft because it was legal and invisible, and my father had signed every page for years. I haven't told him yet. I wasn't ready. And even more than that, I wasn't sure who else in that building knew. First, I called Priya Nair. She'd been our CFO for 9 years, since before I'd even started full-time, and she was the only one in that office who'd never once treated me like the founder's daughter and not a colleague. She had taught me on our first accounting system herself, patient with every mistake, and in 9 years, I had never seen her flustered. Now, she was flustered. I put the spreadsheet in front of her at her kitchen table on a Sunday, with no preamble. She read it twice, the coffee going cold by her elbow. Then she looked up at me and said quietly, "How long have you known?" 11 days, I said. I didn't want to be wrong. "You're not wrong," she said. "You're late. So am I." She'd noticed the discrepancies in the margins 8 months ago and thought it was just a bookkeeping glitch from an old system migration. Neither of us thought to ask who had won. Next, we brought in Ray Delgado, quietly, after hours. Ray ran IT, and Ray could see things in the server logs that neither of us could. Ray was a big, quiet man who taped a photo of his 2 daughters inside his laptop lid, and rarely said more than he needed to. He didn't ask many questions when we met with him. He just listened, nodded once, and began pulling up access histories, timestamps, and login patterns, building a picture in silence while Priya and I built one out loud beside him. At about midnight, he wordlessly turned his screen toward us. 2 years ago, Craig Lassiter's account logged in and accessed files not related to the audit. Ray made no comment of his own. He didn't need to. By week's end, the picture was ugly and finished. Eleanor hadn't inherited the company. She'd done something more subtle and more clever. She had built another building inside it, one invisible from the org chart, loyal to her, not my father, and patient enough to wait years for the moment my marriage ended and my guard came down. I knew at last why those divorce papers had gone so smoothly. I thought Marcus was just too gutless to fight it, that some tiny good part of him wanted to make it easy for us both in the end. I don't know whether decency had anything to do with it or not. Eleanor had been almost warm to me at the settlement meeting, squeezing my hand across the table, telling me she hoped we could still be family in the ways that mattered. She no longer needed the marriage. She already had what she wanted, and I was moving through her life without even realizing that I was standing on someone else's foundation all along. My father still did not know. He was 67, and the last 2 years had been harder on him than he had let on. Small things falling, names that need a second to land. By mid-afternoon, weariness had set in behind his eyes, a feeling that only came after 10-hour days on the loading dock when he still worked them himself. He trusted people like the men of his generation trusted a handshake, fully and without much thought of looking twice. And I think Eleanor had noticed that about him before I did. Part of me wanted to protect him from the truth, wanted to fix it quietly, and let him go on thinking the company was all he thought it was. A larger part of me knew that to protect him meant to prove it first, cleanly, so there'd be no room for Craig Lassiter or anyone else on that board to call it a family squabble and quietly bury it in committee. So Priya and I decided to. We needed a full forensic pull, every vendor contract, every wire transfer with Birchgate's name on it, and every login from every device that touched those files. Ray said he could do it quietly, but not invisibly. Eventually, someone would see the request in the system. I thought of the keycard in my desk. I reflected on how long I had access to the keycard that I shouldn't have had, and how little time I probably had left to use it. That night, alone in the house, I opened my laptop in the kitchen where Marcus and I used to have dinner, back when I thought that kitchen was part of a life that was only mine, unburdened by anyone else's ambitions. I was typing the authorization request myself, using credentials that technically still worked, on a system that hadn't yet caught up to the fact that I wasn't who they thought I was. My hands didn't tremble. That was the most surprising thing of the whole week. Dana stared at the send button for a long time. The cursor blinked in the quiet kitchen. She clicked it. Whoever was watching that account would know in the hour she finally found them. There was no going back to ignorance now, and some part of her had never wanted to. By 9 the next morning, my keycard didn't work anymore. Not in the server room, not by the side entrance, not even in the elevator bank I'd used every day for 6 years. I stood in the lobby, holding it up to the reader 3 times before the security guard, a kid named Owen, who normally waved me through with a smile, looked up with an expression I didn't recognize on him. Sorry, be cautious. People often react negatively when they are given information without understanding the reasons behind it. He reached for the phone without quite looking at me. I'll call someone. I didn't wait for him to complete his number. Instead, I called Priya from the parking lot, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting for it. They cut you off, she said. There's no question about it. In 12 hours, I said. I didn't expect that account to be under as much scrutiny as it is. Before Priya and I finished the call, my phone buzzed with a notification. My phone buzzed before Priya and I had even finished the call, waiting for the second line. The name Eleanor was on the screen, calm and unhurried, just as it always looked, even now. I let it ring twice before I picked it up, just to prove to myself I could. Dana, she said, warm as always, like she was calling to ask about my weekend plans. Sounds like you've been busy, One word for it is busy. I just want to say this once, and I want you to really hear it, because I do not intend to repeat myself. Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. It just settled on a room and stayed there. Your father's health is not what it used to be. Marcus still loves you more than you realize. Whatever happened between you two, whatever you found digging through old contracts isn't going to give you back the family you lost. It's just going to cost you the one you have left. That's not a threat, I said, shocked at how steady my voice was. That's a warning in the guise of concern. I know the difference now. I've had practice. I hope you do, she said, and hung up before I could say another word, which I later realized was the way she always liked to end every conversation. And the last word was said, and the door was shut on her terms before anybody could reach for the handle. Not home. I went straight to Priya's house, gripping the wheel the whole way, Eleanor's voice ringing like a terrible song I couldn't get out of my head. We were at her kitchen table again, and this time Ray came along as well, his laptop bag slung over one shoulder, looking like he hadn't slept at all, though he'd clearly stopped for coffee somewhere on the way. An hour after the request cleared, they yanked my access, he said, putting the laptop down carefully as if it were something fragile. Not until I mirrored everything onto an external drive. I saved every contract, every wire record, and every login history from the past 3 years. How much of it survived? I asked, hardly daring to hope. All of it, he said, with the flat confidence of a man who took no pride in the statement, just facts. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I don't ask permission to back things up. I just do it. Every time. no exceptions. Dot. For the first time in 11 days, I let myself feel something like relief. Small and fragile, but real. Dot. It didn't last. 2 days later, Priya called before 7 in the morning. Her voice was tight, as I'd never heard in all 9 years of working together. Craig Lassiter filed a formal complaint, she said. He's telling the board you've been logging into systems without authorization since the divorce. He says it's a family feud from a disgruntled ex-employee disguised as official business in spreadsheets. He wants you locked out of the building until review, starting today. I still work there, I said. That's what I do. That's what I've been doing long before he walked through the door. Not by his standards. He argues that your position should have been redefined as soon as Marcus left the company payroll, given that half of your equity was originally acquired through the marriage. He's spinning it, Dana, but he's spinning it well enough that 2 board members are already listening, nodding along like it makes sense. I thought of the 4 names I'd written on my legal pad, the names I'd stared at until 2 in the morning less than 2 weeks ago. I realized, with a clarity approaching calmness, that Craig had been on that audit committee for this moment. The purpose was not to expose fraud while it was happening, to conceal whoever finally discovered it. When's the board meeting? I asked. Thursday. Regular quarterly meeting. He wants to add your review as a new business. Then I want to be in that room, I said. Called later, not before it. We should be in that room from the beginning, with everything we have. Priya was silent for a moment. No, that's not how new business items work. You'd need Tom to add you to the agenda directly. Then I will ask him myself. I wasn't going to tell my father everything on the phone, but there was no time to do it any gentler way, so I drove to his house that night instead and sat with him at the same kitchen table I'd eaten dinner at as a kid, the same chipped edge on the corner I used to run my thumb along during homework. I told him everything slowly and in order, following the method that Ray had taught us. The consulting contracts, the 4 hires, one by one, with their names and their subtle links. The margin sharing clause was buried in language he himself, a man who had read every contract for 40 years, had skimmed past without a second thought. He didn't speak much while I was talking. He held his coffee cup in both hands and never drank from it. When I finished, the steam had long since disappeared. After I finished speaking, he remained quiet for a long time, during which I began to wonder if I had made a mistake by telling him everything at once. I signed all of it, he said at last. Every page, every one. You trust her. It's not the same as being reckless, Dad. It's close enough to feel the same right now, sitting here. He looked older in that moment than I'd ever seen him look, and then, slowly, something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked less like defeat and more like the specific, focused anger I remembered from childhood, the anger he used to bring to problems on the loading dock, the anger of a man who fixed things instead of sitting still and mourning them. At last, he set down the cup. Put yourself on the agenda for Thursday, he said. Give it to me. Give me everything you have. Don't hold anything back for me. Thursday came faster than I'd wished it would. Priya and I walked into the boardroom with a flash drive of all that Ray had preserved tucked in my jacket pocket, its weight oddly comforting against my chest. Craig Lassiter was already sitting by the head of the table, near the spot where Eleanor would normally have sat when she was here as an outside advisor. But she wasn't on today's agenda at all. She came anyway, sliding into a chair along the back wall a few minutes after the meeting started, the way she always arrived places. Quietly and exactly when she wanted to, never a minute early, never quite late enough to be noticed walking in. Craig led with his complaint, calm and rehearsed, painting me as an emotional ex-wife going through systems she no longer had any real claim to. 2 board members nodded in agreement. My father let him finish the whole thing without saying a word. He turned to me. Dana has something she wants to show the board. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I'd learned that much from 11 years of watching Eleanor. However, I doubted that Eleanor would appreciate the comparison if I ever told her directly. I laid it out in order, just as we had built it night after night at Priya's kitchen table. The 4 hires and their links to Birchgate were traced. The margin sharing clause, along with the specific dollar amounts it included over 3 years, was quietly diverted, read aloud, plain and unadorned. There were the access logs Ray had saved, with their timestamps and irrefutable evidence of who had reached into what files and exactly when. First, I saw Craig's face change, the confidence slowly oozing out of it. I noticed Wendy Ostrander, who was sitting farther down the table, pausing her hand on the table, her hand pausing mid-sentence on her legal pad. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way that boardrooms rarely are, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Eleanor didn't leave her chair and back. All the time, she watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between calculation and, for a moment, something almost like respect, quickly folded away again. "This is a family affair," Craig said at last, his voice thinner than it had been 10 minutes ago. "It's not a thing for a board meeting. The minute it started costing this company money it never agreed to give away, it stopped being a family affair," my father said. Craig quit before the meeting was over, instead of waiting for the formal removal that the board was already drafting up behind him in whispered asides. The board voted unanimously, and without further discussion, to terminate all contracts associated with Birchgate Partners, effective immediately, and to conduct a full audit of all hires associated with the firm, as far back as the records would allow. Within the hour, Wendy Ostrander had been placed on leave, her badge taken from her desk. That very afternoon, and without ceremony, Gary Fenwick's scheduling access was revoked pending review. Eleanor was up before the vote was even finished, smoothing her jacket in 2 quick motions and leaving without a word to anyone, not even me, her heels sharp against the hallway floor long after the door had closed. I watched her go, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, felt nothing like fear. That night, Marcus called me, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in 11 years, asking if I knew the news was coming, insisting he'd had no idea what his mother had been building behind all of us. I believed some of it, maybe most of it. I let him express his feelings, and then I gently told him that it didn't matter to me, because there was no longer a relationship between us to change. He never called again after that. 3 weeks later, I stood with my father on the warehouse floor, the same floor I'd learned to walk on as a kid, watching a shipment go out on time. No shell companies, no quiet fees, and no one watching who shouldn't have been. He put his hand on my shoulder like he used to when I was small enough to feel like the whole world. "Your grandfather always used to say the company would be in good hands," he said. I thought he meant that the company was struggling financially. I watched the trucks drive away, clean and completely ours again. Vigilance only becomes apparent only when interrupted does vigilance become apparent. If someone had subtly moved your life around to their advantage, would you have noticed as quickly as Dana did? Or would it have taken years, as it did for her? From the outset, which name would you least trust? If this kind of story makes you think, go subscribe to The Long Memory. There's always another one waiting, and you'll want to be there.